Welcome back, everybody, to my YouTube channel. Our guest today is Mr. Jeffrey Higgins, who's a former DEA agent and who was also now a novelist, a writer. He recently wrote a book called The Furious, which I definitely recommend reading because it's a very good, interesting thriller and very entertaining. And so, first of all, Jeff, thanks for your time.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to speak with you again.
Actually, Jeff and I already know each other because we made another interview a few years ago about 9/11 and your involvement with JTTF and your role also in Afghanistan. And that's why we're not covering these topics today because we already did. So my readers or viewers who are interested can find the link to that interview in the description to this video. So let's start with what I have in mind for you today. Can you first of all explain us how the supply chain of narcotics works? Like, how does it get from the producers in Asia or South America to street gangs and final consumers?
Well, it's a kind of a complicated process, but essentially, I'll give you an example of a specific country. I think that'll help. The same type of process is replicated, but it varies based on the type of drugs and the amounts that are involved. But like, for example, I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, the country has the largest amount of hectares under poppy cultivation in the world. So farmers are being paid advances by brokers to grow a certain amount of poppy plants. Then when the harvest time comes, they give the opium. It's harvested, it's scraped off of the poppy plants, and it's given to the brokers. Then the brokers take it to opium dealers. And then the opium dealers work out of bazaars that are across Afghanistan, and people come and they bid, and there's actually it's actually pure capitalism, right? There's a market price that's set on the amount of opium, and so drug traffickers will come in either buy the opium to sell directly locally, or they'll buy it to convert it into either morphine or heroin. So some of them will come, they'll buy it, and it'll be in like that region, it'll be smoked. Opium is smoked in Afghanistan, for example, and then the rest of it will be taken to labs where different groups that work on like exporting heroin and morphine will convert the opium into these various drugs. So they have chemists, they have workers. They're usually mountain labs, that are separated geographically, so that there's some protection from local law enforcement. And then once the drugs are converted, then they're packaged, and they're packaged for sale based on different qualities. So, for instance, in Pakistan and Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, like that area, the stands, there'll be a lower grade brown heroin that people can smoke, or that's just it's a different requirement than like in the West, for example. So the heroin that's going to Europe or going to the United States or other Western countries, it'll be a white heroin. They call it spin mall, which is the highest quality heroin. So it's an injectable heroin. And so from there, often the drug production group, sometimes they're big, like I've dealt with organizations that were transnational criminal groups, but other times they'll sell it to a transporter group who will then deal with a foreign distribution group. So the drugs are transported from, in this case, like Afghanistan. They're done through airports in Islamabad and Kabul. Some of it goes overland through Iran and then like up into Turkey and into Europe in that overland route. Some of it goes into Pakistan and hits the ports like in Quetta, in southern ports, and then is shipped to Africa or to Europe or to the United States. And so there's a variety of ways that these transportation groups will act. Well, and it's like a whole art form. And some of these transportation groups have actually been smuggling various illicit substances for generations. So they've been doing it for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so it's whatever's illegal at the time. And then once it gets to whatever it'll go through like transit countries. Like for instance in Afghanistan, it might make its way into Africa, and then from Africa go to Europe, and from Europe go into the United States. Once it arrives in the United States, then distribution groups, which are generally different groups, will buy the heroin like at kilo prices, and then the importer in the United States will pay maybe 70 or 80 or 90,000 per kilo, they'll then break each of those kilograms down into distribution quantities, or they'll sell it in like quarter kilos or half kilos or whatever to smaller distribution groups, who in turn will sell it to gangs who are on street corners. So in the end, that 1 kilo that maybe cost $5,000 in Afghanistan is worth $1.5 million at the retail level by the time it's broken down into user amounts. So there's a huge profit margin. And rarely, you will see like cartels in Mexico, for instance, that will control it all the way from production to distribution in the United States. And I was involved with a case with the world's largest heroin dealer, Haji Bacho, and he distributed from Afghanistan to 22 countries. And he was selling it to distribution groups in those various countries. So sometimes it's one organization, other times it's just business connections between distribution groups and supply groups. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. It's very interesting and complete explanation. So thank you for that. Once it gets to the United States, what is the main enemy of DEA in fighting drugs? Is it cartels? Is it dealers? Is it gangs? Is it anybody else?
All of the above. It's the major transnational criminal organizations are the ones that are bringing like large amounts of drugs into the U.S. You could argue that the drugs themselves are less of a problem than the violence that's associated with them. But whenever you have illegal drugs, it breeds violence because they can't call the police for help when their drugs are being stolen and things. So when you have a prohibited item that's being sold, violence always comes with it. So on a kind of more visceral level, like on the streets, yeah, gangs are a big problem because that's where a lot of the violence is happening. Gangs protecting their turf, gangs protecting their product, gangs trying to steal money and drugs from other gangs. So that's where a lot of the violence comes from. Like we have MS-13, for example, around the United States, so from coast to coast. And that organization is an international organization. But while the drugs are bad and people are overdosing from opiates and opioids, there are also a lot of people that are suffering from the violence that these gangs are involved with. The cartels themselves are a big problem because, like I mentioned before, they're from actually importing the drugs, which they're responsible for, to getting them onto the streets, right? So it's all cartel-related violence. And in my career, I actually believe, surprisingly, I think drugs are a terrible life choice, but I also believe in legalizing most drugs. I think there's a problem with illegal substances, but I always focus on the violence because wherever you have these illegal substances being sold, you always have unacceptable levels of violence. So for DEA, it's a small agency. It's got about 5,000 agents. Their focus has always been sources of supply, high-value targets who are running these organizations, and also taking out an organization not just from like a gang dealer. Like if you're a metropolitan police officer, in Washington D.C., for example, your focus is what's happening on the street corner or in your patrol zones. If you're a detective, you might be working, who's bringing the drugs into the city. But DEA, we always looked at it like as one cohesive organization, even if they were just a customer, a supplier relationship, even if it wasn't actually the same organization. Where are the drugs coming from? So we continue to make arrests and work our way up the chain to try to get to the actual decision makers and cut the head off the snake, basically.
Okay. How does a typical DEA investigation work? I mean, what would be a typical starting point and a typical trail to follow?
So DEA has, I think it's like 92 offices in like 80 countries around the world, and our foreign offices outside the U.S. Some of them are more liaison positions where DEA officers are passing intelligence and trying to create bigger pictures to identify and uncover these transnational criminal groups. And other places are actually operational, where they're working with the police to conduct operations. So there's a vast difference in foreign offices. And domestically, you might have an office like New York City, right? There's an office in Manhattan. That office is doing a lot of transnational criminal groups, with sources of supply coming from like Colombia, through the Dominican Republic or other islands in the Caribbean and directly into New York. You might, whereas a small office, a smaller, a 5-man office, for example, might be more focused on just working with the local police officers for whatever their local problem is. So a DEA case often it starts with intelligence. So it could be an office where one informant has led to another informant, and as I mentioned before, we're always trying to arrest people and then flip them and trying to go higher and higher in the organization. So one investigation can spin off other investigations. One investigation can lead to an informant who can then help you recruit other informants. It can come from that, or it can come from a foreign tip. It could come from a tip from the intelligence community. It could come from a tip from a local police that DEA agents are working with. Once they identify it, the DEA's mission is to disrupt and dismantle. So ultimately, the goal is to disrupt the entire organization, and the farther up you can take it, the better. I remember when I worked in New York for years, working with the NYPD detectives, and we took down a big organization that were killing people and doing some bad things. I remember telling the detectives, hey, this is great, but now let's go get their source of supply who's in the Dominican Republic, who's in turn getting his drugs from Colombia. And they're like, oh, well, we're never going to get that guy, because it was sort of like the mindset, we've cleared up what's happening here. We've taken down and destroyed this one part of the organization. But DEA's focus is more than that. It's like, okay, but let's get rid of the transporters. Let's get rid of the violent criminal elements within it that are doing, home invasions, and that are let's get rid of the corruption. Let's tackle the money laundering organizations that are moving money, across borders and overseas. And then let's find the transshipment country and take out that group. And then let's get to the source and work with that country to indict and hopefully bring those people back to the U.S. for prosecution. So it's a broader strategic goal for DEA than it is for other law enforcement agencies.
Okay, I forgot to mention that you mentioned MS-13 in the United States being very big. Actually, we have MS-13 in Italy and in Europe as well, and they are very dangerous, and they are often top news when there's some violence involved in big cities. In your bio on your website, you mentioned some of the cases, most important cases you've been investigating, such as the first narco-terrorism arrest, or arresting an Iranian operative who was trying to acquire missiles, surface-to-air missiles. Which of the cases you've investigated is, in your opinion, the most interesting or important one, and why?
There are a lot of interesting cases. I thought the case I mentioned before, the Hachibacho case, where he was literally responsible for 19.7% of the world's heroin. This one guy's organization, and he was the head of it. So convicting him, putting him behind bars, disrupting, making seizures, and we didn't completely dismantle his organization, but we took the head of it out. That was certainly important. I think the most important, though, was a case against Khan Mohammed, it was in 2006. I'd been in Afghanistan for a couple of years, and we'd been showing the linkage between drugs and terrorism because, as DEA, we were doing drug cases, so my focus was narco-terrorism. But the biggest threat in Afghanistan, of course, is terrorism. So I really focused on the top terrorists we could find, and then found ways that they were connected to narcotics, so we had the authority to go after them with the local police. And in 2006, based on all the reporting we'd done, like so many of our cases, showed that linkage between drugs and terrorism. As a matter of fact, 37% approximately of the U.S. Department of State's designated terrorist organizations are some way affiliated with drugs. They're getting some drug income, like the Taliban gets, according to UNODC estimates, something like $150 million a year from drug proceeds. I actually think it's probably much higher than that. So there is this connection. So based on that, the U.S. Congress passed a narco-terrorism law. It's 21 U.S.C. 960A, and I wanted to test that law. So I went back to Afghanistan and looked at our cases, and we learned about a terrorist, a guy who was working with the Taliban who planned on attacking the Jalalabad airfield, which is where I was staying at the time, with rockets. And he was also a drug trafficker. So he trafficked large amounts of opium and things in the past. So that case became the first precedent-setting narco-terrorism case. There had been narco-terrorists arrested before, but this was the first person ever charged with the crime of narco-terrorism. And so I believe that's probably my most significant case. And it's the subject of a nonfiction book I have that my agent is shopping around to publishers right now. It's called Blood and Powder, and it's about my engagement with I was at 9/11, as we talked about before, when that happened, and vowed to get vengeance for what happened and go after the people who did that, and then pushing my agency into narco-terrorism and into the war on terror, and then going through years of people trying to ignore the relationship between drugs and terrorism, and then finally having this law passed, and then making the first case. It was sort of that to me was the most important case I was involved with.
How is usually collaboration between DEA and other agencies such as FBI or ATF? Is it smooth and easy, or are there tensions of any kind?
They're in every country, right? In every, it's just human nature. People are tribalistic by nature. So if different organizations that are working in the same areas compete, it's sort of the way they are everywhere I've ever been. Post 9/11, one of the problems that the 9/11 Commission found was that there was a lot of stovepiping of information between intelligence and law enforcement agencies and things. So it got better for a period of time, then it started getting worse again. It really is just human nature. DEA tends to get along really well with other agencies because everywhere we go, as a small agency, we work, hand in glove with local law enforcement and with other federal agencies, and depending on where you are, everything's personality based. So I've worked with everybody. I've worked with every single, intelligence and law enforcement agency in so many local agencies and foreign intelligence and law enforcement. And it's the people that are involved, the people on the ground. If you can build a relationship between the two people. But sometimes when it goes above that, between two agents, for example, from different agencies who are working on a case, when it gets up to a management or a higher management level, sometimes the politics comes in. What I found, and what I always did, even before 9/11, was try to bring in as many agencies as I could. And we have funding mechanisms in the federal government called OCDF, where you can basically, bring multiple agencies onto one case and there's funding available. And it was a way to take the best of each agency. Some agencies had certain restrictions that other ones didn't. So if you're all working together, the one that didn't have that restriction could do what needed to be done. And I found that was the best way to work together. Other agencies, I don't want to name them, but sometimes they don't work together as well as they should. And certainly when you're talking about intelligence versus law enforcement, those are two very different missions. And with law enforcement, most things are open to public scrutiny as opposed to intelligence where everything's done behind closed doors. And I used to argue with some people I worked with in the intelligence community that they were writing history books because they were so afraid of information being revealed and declassified that they held on to it. Whereas our goal was to take that information and do something proactive with it, go out and actually arrest people. Because it's great to know who the terrorists are. It's great to know, what a transnational criminal organization is doing, smuggling weapons or whatever. But if you don't act on that information, they just keep doing it. So there's always that tension, between what can be revealed and what can't.
Okay, you already said something about crime, other crimes involved with drug dealing, but I would like you to elaborate a little bit. In your experience, does drug dealing bring with itself other types of crimes, such as human trafficking or robberies or even homicides?
Yeah, all of the above, right? And I mean, and the reason is just by the nature of a certain economic activity being illegal, it has to, almost all of it has to be illegal, right? So, like you can the people like MS-13, right? That's a nasty gang that recruits people at a very early age and initiates them in blood so that it breeds a type of sociopath, right? Like it's a bad organization. If drugs were legalized tomorrow, the MS-13 members in your area are not going to open a bed and breakfast the next day. Like there's no natural, like, legitimate role for them to play. So they're going to move into other illegitimate and illicit sources like the weapons trafficking or human trafficking or whatever. So, with drugs, it's the same thing. They have to be able to protect themselves. They need weapons. So they're involved with all these other groups. And also, criminal activity is criminal activity. So if you're talking about moving kilos of heroin from Colombia to the US, you're going to use the same transportation groups that are also involved in human trafficking or weapons smuggling or other illicit substances, right? Like once you have the shipping and the compartments and things, those types of groups will move everything. And you also, because it's an illegal organization, a lot of times, you need to get into other crimes to make it work, from money laundering all the way down. And there was a UNODC study a few years ago. I'm trying to remember, maybe 2017. I remember reading, and it was talking about the connection between organized crime in Europe and drug trafficking. And the numbers were, I think, I want to say like 33 to 50% of the organized crime groups were getting a significant amount of their proceeds from drug trafficking. And it just makes sense. So what else are they going to do? And it's the markup on those drugs. Like I mentioned before, a $5,000 kilo can end up being worth $1.5 million. You don't see markups like that in any other kind of substance. So even organizations that are criminal for other reasons, tend to get into drugs because of the vast amounts of money, and terrorists are a big part of that.
Okay. Let me ask you your opinion on something very recent. You're also an expert in Afghanistan. So, what do you think about President Biden's decision to pull the United States forces from Afghanistan by September, actually, by 9/11? Because while I understand that the USA is not supposed to be the sheriff of the world, my fear is that Afghanistan will plunge back into chaos again.
Well, I mean, that's a legitimate fear, and I think that's exactly what's going to happen. In fairness, it's not, it is happening under Biden's administration, so he has responsibility for that. But the Trump administration before him also was in the process of pulling the U.S. out, and Obama's administration before that was also withdrawing people from Afghanistan, right? So it's been bipartisan in the U.S. Both political parties have been trying to do this, and I think it's very short-sighted. I think that the problem really comes from like the concept of containment back from like the 50s when it was the USSR and the United States engaged in this Cold War. Everyone was afraid of direct conflict between Soviet troops and American troops. So from Vietnam on, we were in Korea and Vietnam, we were looking at fighting this Cold War through proxy groups. And I think it changed the definition of what war is. If there's a reason to go to war, whether it's a humanitarian reason because the people are being oppressed, or it's the expansion of communism by a totalitarian state, whatever it may be. Once war is justified, the goal should be to win it, to defeat the enemy, so they know they're defeated, and you've won, and then reinstall something different. And I think that Cold War mentality of fighting through proxies changed that in people's minds. So the whole problem with Afghanistan is we took over the country very quickly, but we never ended the problem. I remember when President Bush told President Musharraf in Pakistan, you're either with us or against us. I think it's a great moment, but when he said he was with you, we then let Pakistan handle their own problems. But all the Taliban and to this day, a lot of the leadership of them, the myriad of terrorist groups that are operating in that region, are in like the western part of Pakistan, and it's an area like the Khyber Agency, they're not really controlled by the government. It's controlled by Islamists. And so by not going in there and ending the problem, it was never going to go away. So it almost requires a U.S. presence in Afghanistan because the government itself, it's rife with corruption. There's a lot of incompetence. It hasn't existed for the country itself has existed for a long time, but not in a modern like state according to Western standards that we'd expect. So the thought that their military can just pick up when the U.S. pulls out is absurd, right? You see it now. The U.S. isn't even fully out, and already the Taliban's taken over something like a third of the country. It's only a matter of time. And Afghanistan has the highest concentration of terrorist groups in the world, right? They were obviously running the government before under the Taliban, which is one of the worst, most oppressive regimes in the world. And that's just going to happen again. There's no way to stop that. So I think not finishing the war the way it should have been done and allowing this safe zone, sort of like a Laos in the Vietnam War, we allowed this safe zone in Pakistan, even though we were doing drone strikes and things, we weren't going in there and cleaning up the problem. And we're also not addressing the roots of Islamic terrorism. The Muslim Brotherhood is a worldwide organization that's essentially the command and control for all of mostly of Sunni and Shia Islamic terrorism, and we're not addressing them. As a matter of fact, the U.S. government has even worked with them. That's a huge problem. Not addressing madrasas that are teaching hatred and terrorism. They're mosques around the world, not all of them, but there are mosques around the world, including in the U.S., that are the command and control for these terrorist groups, and even used to store weapons and things. So it's while there are hundreds of millions of Muslims who don't believe in terrorism, right? It's not if you're Muslim you believe in this. That's not true. There's many Muslims, and there's like the Mu'tazila and other groups besides Sunni and Shia that believe in a more modern version, that's tolerant of other people and other religions, and even people within Sunni and Shia also believe this because they're not radical, right? They're not extreme fundamentalists within the religion. But if we're not addressing any of that, right? We're just addressing what's in front of us at this time, and we never completely destroyed the radical Islamic elements that were across the border in Afghanistan. So and a lot of that we did by hindering ourselves with what we were doing in Afghanistan by really restrictive rules of engagement and wanting the Afghanization of the process, where Afghan politicians and Afghan military were the face of these operations. When we should have just gone in there, if it's a threat to our country, then we should have gone in there and fixed it, as opposed to this kind of halfway Cold War mentality approach that we took.
Okay. And one other political topic that is being discussed pretty much everywhere, also in Italy, is legalizing light drugs. What are your thoughts about it?
So, I mean, politically, I'm mostly libertarian, right? I believe in freedom. I believe in individual freedom and individual responsibility. I don't believe in having governments enact paternalistic laws to tell me what's legal and illegal based on what's good for me. Having said that, it's a horrible idea to take drugs improperly, right? Some of these drugs, like fentanyl, for instance, right? That's a miracle drug, right? It's an analgesic. It's a miracle drug for being used properly when needed for surgeries and things like that. But if you start to abuse it, not only is it highly emotionally and physically addicting, but the chance of overdosing when you're getting it from illicit sources is very high. And we have an opioid epidemic right now in the United States. It's around the world, but it's really horrible here. So I'm really against. I'm against interfering with your own mind, because that's the only way you can discern reality and use your own reason to figure out what are the best choices and what you should be doing in life. So I'm against interfering with that, however you're doing it. But I'm also against the paternalistic laws, because, like we talked about before, as soon as you do that, you've made it an illegal organization. Now there's violence that comes with it. Now there's no quality control. If a local pharmacy is able to sell me a certain drug, I can know if it's coming from a big, international pharmaceutical company, that it's probably not going to kill me if I take it as directed. But if I'm getting it from the MS-13 gang member on the corner, I don't know what's in it or how much is in it, which is part of the problem, right? People are buying heroin and things that are laced with fentanyl or carfentanil. Some of these opioids that are 100 times more powerful than heroin, so they're overdosing and taking this massive dose. Carfentanil was actually originally developed as a weapon of mass destruction, and then it was a veterinary analgesic. I mean, it's really, really dangerous. And so some drugs like that, I think, have to be controlled, just because if I had a little sandwich baggie filled with carfentanil and I threw it on a subway train, everybody would OD on the train. They can inhale it; it goes through the skin. It's like a nuclear substance. I believe radioactive materials should be controlled, right, because of the externalities. But
You just mentioned that you're about to publish another novel. So, would you like to tell about something about the book?
So I just published Furious Terror, which is a psychological horror. It's getting great reviews on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. The new book is called Unseen: Evil Lurks Among Us, and it's about a rookie homicide detective who stumbles on a string of murders in Washington, D.C., and uncovers an underlying terrorist conspiracy. And I go back and forth between this rookie detective and the killer, who's a vigilante. So the book deals with vigilantism. It deals with Islamic infiltration, Islamic terrorist infiltration, and issues of the rule of law, and what happens when the rule of law isn't present. So I think there's some good underlying issues, but it's really just like a gritty kind of noir crime thriller.
Okay, Jeff, many thanks for your time again. And I recommend my viewers to read your first book. And I also look forward to reading your next one next month. So thank you for your time. Thank you, everybody, for watching this, and see you next time.
Great.